For 6 minutes, no one on Earth could reach them. 4 people, 1 heat shield, and a design that had already failed once. On the flight before this one, that same shield came home wrong. It cracked. Pieces broke off in more than 100 places, where nothing was ever supposed to break. NASA said it understood why, and one of its own former astronauts, a man who had spent years finding out why a different spacecraft never came home, said in writing that it did not. Now 4 human beings were about to ride that shield back from the moon, falling at 24,000 miles per hour into a wall of fire 5,000 degrees hot, wrapped in a silence so complete that no signal, no word, no cry for help could pass through it. This is the story of those 6 minutes, and of the quiet, bitter argument happening in the background between people who all wanted the crew to live, over whether those 6 minutes should have been risked at all. The day before splashdown, a man named Amit Kshatriya stood in front of the cameras. He is one of the most senior people at NASA, an associate administrator, an engineer who has spent his career on human spaceflight, and he chose his words with the care of someone who knows they will be replayed. He said the agency had high confidence in the heat shield, in the parachutes, in the recovery systems, and then he said something that landed harder than a press conference usually does. Tomorrow, he told the room, the crew was going to put their lives behind that confidence. That is not the language of routine. That is the language of a bet placed with someone else's life. Because inside NASA, not everyone agreed the bet was safe. A former astronaut had already written a letter to the head of the agency, warning that the decision to fly this heat shield as it was could be a mistake. His name was Charles Camarda, and he was not a bystander throwing stones. He had flown on the mission that returned humans to space after the Columbia disaster. He had helped lead the teams that figured out why Columbia's 7 astronauts died. His argument was simple, and it was hard to dismiss. NASA, he said, did not fully understand what had gone wrong the first time, and you cannot safely predict a failure you do not truly understand. So hold on to the question that hung over this entire mission, from the launch pad to the final descent. Was NASA right that the problem was solved? Or was it about to send 4 people into the one part of spaceflight that has already killed astronauts, trusting a fix that the man who knew that grief best did not believe in? The answer, it turns out, is not as clean as a safe landing makes it look. To feel why 6 minutes could matter that much, you have to understand how much time had passed and how much energy was involved. The last time a human being rode a spacecraft home from the moon, it was 1972. More than 50 years went by. Entire generations were born, grew up, and had children of their own, without ever watching a crew return from lunar distance. The knowledge of how to do it lived in old film reels, and in the memory of people now in their 80s. And returning from the moon is not like returning from orbit. A spacecraft coming home from the space station falls into the atmosphere at around 17,000 miles per hour. That is fast. But a spacecraft coming home from the moon carries far more speed and far more energy, and every bit of that energy has to be turned into heat and thrown away before the capsule can touch the ocean. On the way home, the crew's spacecraft reached 24,661 miles per hour. That is more than 30 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, they came within about 130 miles per hour of the fastest any human beings have ever traveled, a record set by the crew of Apollo 10 in 1969, and untouched for more than half a century, and they went farther than almost anyone before them. At the peak of the mission, the 4 of them were 252,760 miles from Earth, farther than any human had been since Apollo, breaking the old distance record held by the crew of Apollo 13 by more than 4,000 miles. Sit with what that actually means. To come home from the moon, you do not simply fall out of the sky. You arrive going almost as fast as the fastest humans in history, and then you ask a layer of material a few inches thick to erase every bit of that speed, cleanly, evenly, without a single failure, while 4 people sit on the other side of it and wait to find out if it will hold. And speed is deceptive, because danger does not rise in a straight line with it. The energy a spacecraft has to shed climbs with the square of its velocity. Come home 40% faster, and you are not facing 40% more heat. you are facing roughly twice as much. That is the real gap between returning from orbit and returning from the moon. It is not a small step up in difficulty. It is a different category of fire. There is a human version of that gap too. The engineers who solved this problem for Apollo, the ones who filled those honeycomb cells by hand and watched their capsules come home, are mostly gone now. Many of them never lived to see anyone try it again. The people who flew this mission were, in a real sense, rediscovering something the world had allowed itself to forget. Reading old reports, rebuilding lost intuition, relearning by doing what had not been done in half a century. Every generation assumes the hard things stay solved. They do not. Skills fade. Knowledge leaves with the people who carried it. And sometimes you have to earn the answer all over again, at full speed, with lives riding on it. For 50 years, no crew had asked that question. Now 4 of them were about to. They were not numbers on a flight plan. They had names and faces and people at home counting the days. Reed Wiseman was the commander, a Navy test pilot who had already lived aboard the International Space Station, now responsible not only for himself, but for the 3 lives strapped in beside him. Victor Glover was the pilot, an aviator who kept reminding people that this flight did not belong to him or to NASA, but to all of human history. Christina Koch had once held the record for the longest single spaceflight ever flown by a woman, and on this mission, she traveled farther from Earth than any woman ever had. And Jeremy Hansen from the Canadian Space Agency was the one who had never flown in space at all. His very first trip off the planet was a voyage around the moon. They named their spacecraft Integrity. And standing behind them, mostly unseen, was the other half of this story, the engineers, hundreds of them. The people who had spent 2 years staring at photographs of a scarred heat shield, arguing in windowless rooms, running the same tests again and again, trying to earn the right to say the word safe. Some of them were certain. Some of them, privately, were not. And every one of them understood the cruel arithmetic of what was coming, that when the plasma closed in and the radio went dead, there would be nothing left for any of them to do but sit in a quiet control room and wait to learn whether they had done their jobs well enough. There would be no fixing it from the ground. There would only be the waiting. To understand what they were afraid of, you have to go back to the first flight. In November of 2022, an uncrewed version of this exact spacecraft flew around the moon and came home. No astronauts, a test. And when the recovery teams pulled it out of the Pacific and turned it over to inspect the heat shield, they found something they had not predicted. In more than 100 separate locations, the outer layer of the shield had cracked, and charred chunks had broken off entirely. That is not how the shield is supposed to work. It is built from a material called avcoat, a resin packed with silica fibers, engineered to slowly char and burn away, layer by microscopic layer, carrying the heat off with it as it goes. It is meant to erode smoothly, gently almost. It is absolutely not supposed to fracture and fling pieces of itself into the sky. And the difference between those two behaviors is the difference between life and death. That heat shield has to survive temperatures near 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 2,760 degrees Celsius, half as hot as the visible surface of the sun, and far hotter than anything a capsule returning from orbit ever feels. On this re-entry, that peak temperature would arrive barely 90 seconds after the spacecraft first touched the atmosphere. If the shield came apart in the wrong spot at the wrong instant, the fire finds a way in. And if the fire finds a way in, there is no second attempt. Here is a detail that tells you how hard this problem really was. On the old Apollo capsules, the heat shield was a honeycomb mold. Roughly 360,000 tiny cells, each one filled with avcoat by hand. The modern spacecraft is larger, and instead of a honeycomb, it is covered with about 200 large avcoat blocks. That change in design, it turned out, changed how the material behaved under fire in ways nobody had fully anticipated. So NASA did what serious engineers do. They investigated. And in 2024, the agency's own Office of Inspector General laid out a cause. As the shield heated up, gases were being generated inside the avcoat itself through a process called pyrolysis. Those gases needed somewhere to go, and they could not escape fast enough. Pressure built up underneath the surface of the shield. and that trapped pressure blew pieces off, from the inside out. That is one explanation, and the fix that followed came directly from it. For the crewed flight, engineers used a more porous version of the avcoat, a formulation designed to let those trapped gases vent, instead of building up and cracking the surface. And they changed the route home, easing the spacecraft through the atmosphere on a gentler, more gradual path to spread out the heat. They tested the new material in arc jet facilities, machines that blast a sample with superheated gas to imitate the fury of re-entry on the ground. And the results, they said, matched what they expected. But understand the position NASA was actually in when it made that choice, because it was not a comfortable one. Once the cracking was found, the agency faced two roads, and neither was clean. It could tear the heat shield design down to the studs and rebuild it from scratch, the safest sounding option, and one that would have delayed the entire mission by 2 years or more. Or it could keep the shield it already had, change the material, and change the way the spacecraft flew home to lower the heat it had to survive. NASA chose the second road. The centerpiece of that road was the trajectory itself. Instead of diving straight in, the spacecraft would fly a lofted, Apollo-style entry, dipping into the upper atmosphere, using it to bleed off speed, then riding a longer, gentler arc down toward the ocean. Picture a stone skipped across water instead of dropped into it. The longer path meant the heat arrived more slowly and more evenly, giving that redesigned avcoat time to do its work without the pressure spiking all at once. On paper, it was elegant. It was also, by its very nature, a compromise. The engineers were not returning to a shield they completely trusted and flying it exactly the way it was built to fly. They were flying a modified shield, on a modified path, chosen partly because the alternative would have cost years the program did not want to spend. That is not recklessness, but it is a decision shaped by pressure, schedule pressure, political pressure, the weight of a program that had already waited decades to put humans back near the moon. And decisions shaped by pressure are exactly the kind that later investigations tend to circle back to: confident, documented, solved. But this is exactly where the case splits in two, and to see the crack in the story, you have to listen to the people who refused to sign off on it. Charles Camarda was one of them. Remember who he is. He is not an outsider. He is a former NASA astronaut and an engineer who specialized in exactly this: thermal protection, the structures that keep spacecraft from burning up. And after Columbia broke apart, he was one of the people who dug into why. His entire later career became a study of one uncomfortable question: why do brilliant, careful organizations convince themselves a deadly problem is solved right before it kills someone again? His warning about this heat shield cut straight to that nerve. He argued that the trapped gas story might describe what happened without truly explaining why it happened, that changing the trajectory to lower the heat could carry consequences no one had modeled, and that flying the shield as is, without fully nailing down the root cause, was the same mistake that had been made before. In his letter to the head of NASA, he put it in words that are hard to forget. "History," he wrote, "shows accidents occur when organizations convince themselves they understand problems they do not." And he was not the only cautious voice. Jacqueline McCleary, a physicist at Northeastern University, was asked point-blank about the odds of the heat shield failing. Her honest answer was not reassuring. The odds, she said, were largely uncertain, so which story was true? A problem understood and repaired, or a problem papered over with confidence and a schedule? From the outside, before the flight, you genuinely could not tell. Both explanations fit the very same facts. The porous avcoat might have solved it completely, or it might have only reduced a danger that no one had actually cornered. And the only way in the universe to find out which was true was to put 4 human beings inside that capsule and fly them into the fire. And here is the part we do not talk about enough. The crew knew all of it. They knew about the cracks on the first flight. They knew about the descent inside their own agency. They knew that a respected astronaut, a man who had helped bury the lessons of Columbia into every safety rule they now lived by, had put his objection in writing. And they climbed into that spacecraft and flew to the moon anyway. There is a strange and specific kind of courage in that. It is not the courage of not knowing the danger. It is the courage of knowing it precisely, in engineering detail, reading the dissenting letter, and then choosing to place your trust in the people who built the thing beneath your seat. And this was not the first silence they had to survive on this trip. Days earlier, as their spacecraft swung behind the far side of the moon, they slipped into a different blackout, a planned loss of signal that lasts around 40 minutes, when the body of the moon itself stands between the crew and every antenna on Earth. For those 40 minutes, they were the most isolated human beings in the history of our species. No one had ever been that alone, that far away. And then the moon released them. Earth rose back over the horizon, and their voices returned. That was rehearsal. This was the real thing. On the 10th day, the spacecraft hit the top of the atmosphere at 400,000 feet, still about 1,950 miles from the patch of ocean where it was meant to land, and within seconds the plasma closed in. That is the physics of coming home fast. At these speeds, the spacecraft compresses the air in front of it so violently that the air itself tears apart and turns to plasma, a glowing sheath of electrically charged gas that wraps the entire capsule in fire. And that plasma does something merciless. It blocks radio completely. Nothing gets in. Nothing gets out. The screens in mission control went still. The crew went silent. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because for the next 6 minutes, the laws of physics simply would not permit a single word to pass between the 4 people inside that fireball and everyone on Earth who loved them. 6 minutes, that is how long the worst of it lasts. 6 minutes in which the heat shield does its most violent work. 6 minutes in which the crew is crushed into their seats at nearly 4 times their own body weight, 3.9 Gs. 6 minutes in which the engineers who built the shield, the families holding their breath, and the astronaut who had written the warning letter all had to sit in the very same darkness and wait to learn who had been right. All the arguing was over. All the testing was done. The decision had already been made. Now there was only the silence, and the fire, and the waiting. And the blackout is only the sharpest edge of a longer gauntlet. From the moment the spacecraft first bites into the atmosphere to the moment it touches the water, the whole descent runs something like 13 minutes. 13 minutes of events that all have to happen, in the right order, on time, with no chance to fix a single one. The heat shield has to hold. The spacecraft has to keep its blunt end pointed into the fire, because if it tumbles even slightly, the unprotected sides meet temperatures they were never built to survive. The guidance has to steer a capsule through plasma it cannot see out of, and every one of those steps runs on its own, automatically, because for 6 of those minutes, there is no one on Earth who can reach in to help. Inside, the astronauts later described it as a shift from control into something closer to sensory overload. In the quiet before, they were monitoring, checking, working the procedures. Then the fire built up around the windows, the G-forces pressed them down into their seats, the capsule shook, and the world outside became a wall of orange light with no Earth and no stars beyond it. There was, one of them admitted, very little left to actually do. The machine was flying itself, and all a human being could do was ride it and trust it. You know the blackout is coming. You know there is nothing you could say into a radio that no signal can carry out. So you breathe, and you wait, and you let the shield decide. We know what that silence can cost, because it has collected its price before. On the 1st of February, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia was coming home. 7 astronauts aboard: Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon. It was supposed to be the easy part. Re-entry was the phase they had flown safely dozens of times. But on the way up, 16 days earlier, a piece of foam had struck the shuttle's wing and damaged its thermal protection. And on the way down, at the worst possible moment, the heat found that wound and poured in. Columbia broke apart in the sky over Texas. All 7 were lost, minutes from home, after everything else had gone right. That is the shadow every re-entry lives beneath, and it is why one man could not stay quiet about a cracked heat shield, because Charles Camarda was there for Columbia. He flew on the very next crewed mission, the return to flight, the nervous voyage that put astronauts back into space after the fleet had been grounded for more than 2 years. He helped lead the investigation into why Columbia's crew died. He watched, up close, how a great institution full of careful people had noticed a problem, failed to fully understand it, and kept flying anyway, until it cost 7 friends their lives. Years later, he would say it plainly. They never truly figured out what made that foam break away, and they flew regardless. And it was not only the foam that failed on Columbia. In the years afterward, investigators found something harder to repair than any piece of hardware. Engineers had raised concerns during that final flight, worries about the damage to the wing, and those concerns had been set aside, filtered out, never pushed hard enough up the chain to change anything. On the surface, the tragedy was technical. Underneath, it was cultural, a great organization that had, without ever meaning to, become better at reassuring itself than at listening to its own doubts. That is the lesson Camarda carried out of Columbia and into the rest of his life. Not that heat shields are dangerous, everyone knows that, but that the deadliest failure inside a high-risk organization is the quiet decision to stop asking whether you might be wrong. When he looked at the Artemis shield and heard the language of high confidence, that was the pattern he was afraid he recognized. He was not predicting the shield would fail. He was warning that certainty itself, in a place like this, has a body count. So when Camarda looked at the Artemis heat shield, a shield that had cracked, a root cause the agency admitted it could not completely rule out, and a decision to fly it as it was, he was not seeing an abstract engineering dispute. He was seeing the same shape as the tragedy he had spent his life trying to make sure never happened again. He might have been wrong. The engineers who cleared the shield were serious, and they were not gambling carelessly. They were carrying Columbia in the room with them too, in every decision. But this is the truth underneath the whole mission. Nobody in that control room could be certain. Behind every clean diagram of a descent profile, there were 4 real people, and a set of chairs at home that might have stayed empty. The stakes were never abstract, they never are. And then, the radio came back. The plasma thinned, the signal returned. The spacecraft, still moving thousands of miles an hour, began the last act of its descent. Small drogue parachutes snapped open first, high up to steady and slow it. Then, lower down, the great main canopies unfurled and caught the air, and the capsule that had been a falling star only minutes earlier drifted down through the last few thousand feet and touched the Pacific at the speed of a slow bike ride. The 4 of them were home. On the deck of the recovery ship, teams moved in to secure the capsule and bring the crew out into the open air of a planet they had left 10 days earlier. They had gone farther than any humans in more than 50 years. They had ridden a repaired shield through a fire that had killed before, and they had come back with a scorched, intact capsule and 4 beating hearts. In the days that followed, engineers began taking the spacecraft apart, studying every inch of that heat shield, measuring what they found against everything they had predicted. The real exam, the one that could finally tell them whether they had understood the problem or simply survived it. Because from the outside, those 2 outcomes look identical. A safe landing feels like proof. It rarely is. It is only ever one data point, one flight, one shield, one set of conditions, and the universe keeps the rest of its answers to itself until the next time you dare to ask. When Navy divers reached the spacecraft and looked at the heat shield, it was nearly pristine. The cracking and the lost chunks that had scarred the first flight were almost entirely gone, reduced dramatically in both size and number. By that measure, the only measure that returns 4 people alive, NASA had been right. The crew, when they could finally speak about it, struggled to find the words. One of them admitted, simply, that they had not yet processed what they had just done. But here is the tension that does not fully resolve, and it is worth sitting inside of. A shield that holds does not prove that everyone understood it. Sometimes you are right for exactly the reasons you believed, and sometimes you are simply lucky, and you never learn the difference until the one time you are not. Charles Camarda was not proven wrong by a safe splashdown. He was proven lucky, along with everyone else. And the man who investigated Columbia would be the first to tell you that those are not the same thing. That is the quiet truth beneath every return from the moon. We go out into a place that does not care whether we live. And to come back, we build a few inches of material. We argue about it in rooms full of good people who do not agree. And then we ask 4 human beings to bet their lives on whichever side won the argument. 6 minutes of silence, 4 people, 1 shield that held. We call it a test flight. It might be more honest to call it an act of faith, with the math attached. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.